I have been meaning to make a video on this episode of Avatar for a long time, because it is one that has a special resonance for me personally. I watch this every year on Halloween. This is the scary episode of Avatar, and considering how often I watch Avatar, I decide that I'm going to watch this every year. It's appropriate. But it's also just a great, tense, psychologically unnerving episode of television. It's one that moves from the exterior to the interior, from the horrors out there in the world seeming so bizarre and mysterious, to someone very specific and knowable, and someone who initially seems at least somewhat sympathetic, and ultimately through that condensation into specificity, it becomes even more unnerving, more destabilizing, because the true horror, the true unease, is in the heart of Katara herself. She is terrified that she has a lot of Hama in her. She knows that she is similar to Hama. Similar to this woman who could perform such grotesque actions despite seeming so nice initially. And she feels even more similar to her by the ending of the episode, because she has to use blood bending in order to save her friends. Yes, she does not do this out of malice or out of resentment. She does it in the service of personal salvation, to help herself and to help those around her. But that's why Hama used it initially too. And yet that righteous usefulness of it curdled into this resentment and this malice. Katara is not terrified because the world is so unknowable and so dark and corrosive. No, she's terrified because that grotesque, nightmarish underside of the world manifests in someone who initially seems quite sympathetic and quite caring and quite similar to her. And because of that similarity, she's left not only feeling the deep tragedy and heartbreak of Hama's story, of someone who was brutally beaten by a callous world, who was stolen from her home and kidnapped, and yet who became a monster herself. Katara deeply feels that tragedy, but she feels it more deeply than the others, not only because she's the one who trusted Hama the most, but because she trusted Hama because she felt this deep kinship with her, this deep sense of similarity, of likeness. And so she is afraid for herself and afraid a little of herself. Season 3 has a lot of brilliant Katara episodes, but this is probably my second favorite, second only to the Southern Raiders, which is the episode that delivers the payoff, blood-curdling and unsettling, to the blood-bending narrative introduced in this episode. So there is this movement from the external, from the uncertain and the bizarre, to the internal, to the specific. And that's where a lot of the dread of this episode comes from. I think a lot about what Freud says regarding the uncanny, or the unheimlich, as he puts it, in Joyman. The uncanny is interesting for Freud because it has these two similar meanings. Unheimlich in German is most literally something like unhomeliness. As in, something that appears to be familiar, appears to be something known and understandable, is really something bizarre and strange and unnerving. And okay, that's fine. That's all well and good. I think we can all agree that that's rather disturbing and rather unsettling. But what Freud really does that's genius is that he looks at this also in terms of its reverse, the other side of it, which is that it's something strange, it's something bizarre and grotesque, revealing itself to be something familiar. Not in the way that because it's familiar, it's comfortable and it's not really threatening, but no, because the bizarre and unsettling and the other, the quintessentially not us, is revealed to be something very similar to what we already know, what we already understand. It very much undermines that basic sense of what is home, what is familiar, what do we believe we understand. Those set aspects of the home domain, the home environment, suddenly seem twisted and strange and much more nightmarish than mere repetition and habit would suggest. Katara experiences this second and more profoundly disquieting sense of uncanniness. Everyone feels this weird anxiety about Hama, who starts off as being a somewhat strange innkeeper who nonetheless treats them well and is relatively sympathetic toward them, and honestly does not really have any negative intentions toward them specifically. And I think that's important. She is a bit like a kind of fairy tale antagonist, like the witch in Hansel and Gretel. But she's not planning to eat them. She's not planning to lock them away and torture them, as she does with the people of the Fire Nation. Her simple hospitality is, in a certain respect, real and genuine, but in a deeper and more profound look at her, one understands how limited that hospitality is. It only extends to people that she considers worthy of it because of their background. If you are Fire Nation, you are automatically allied with the people who tortured her, and thus you are not deserving of sympathy, and you are instead deserving of resentment and bitterness and violence. So the known, the familiar in Hama is revealed to be something strange and wicked. And again, okay, that's fine. Katara goes through something a bit deeper and a bit more affecting, I think. Which is that something that appears strange is made familiar. It's made into something that is known. Because she is so close to Hama, the wickedness of Hama being revealed does more than simply have the effect it has for the others, which is, oh, this person seems reliable, and it turns out they weren't. Turns out they were quite cruel and scheming. Katara has to understand that someone can be very similar to her, can share her culture and traditions, can share her passion for waterbending, can share her rather impressive guile and thoughtfulness and creativity about using waterbending, and still be wicked. The darkness, the vile antagonist of this episode, is in fact revealed to be something familiar. And so that unsettles the familiar. It unsettles the basic concept of what is known, what is comfortable, what is reliable and understandable, and ultimately it undermines Katara's basic trust in herself. This is made manifest with the bloodbending, where Katara, through using this bloodbending, is forced to recognize the connection between herself and Hama. They are both bloodbenders. They both have now used this forbidden technique, and so they are linked because of that. That's the kind of symbolism that works, because it's not just symbolism. It has an overt and literal meaning in terms of the fact that they are bound by bloodbending, but it also has the secondary and more thematic meaning, the symbolic meaning, that is layered on top of that, which is this greater sense of the similarities, the links between them as people. Katara understands how similar she is to Hama, and that is why she reacted so strongly and so positively at first. They're both people who have suffered greatly. They're both people who deeply care about their culture and tradition. They're both people who are motivated by a deep sense of injustice and wanting to correct a unbalanced and twisted world. Hama is the clearest signal Katara receives about what can happen to those impulses when they go wrong. What can happen to this desire for justice, this connection to culture, this general creativity and passion for one's bending as a sense of art, when it is curdled by this disdain, by this willingness to resort to violence, cruel and wanton and unnecessary violence against a group of people that one has considered to be bad and deserving of it, since they are the oppressors, even if they personally have not done anything innately horrible as individuals. And to a certain extent, and Katara understands this too, even if they have, that does not necessarily mean that reacting in the most violent and vengeful way against them is just. This is a conflict that Katara has to deal with profoundly in the Southern Raiders episode. Katara is disturbed because she was forced to become a bloodbender and forced to use this wicked and forbidden technique that takes control of people and forces them to obey your will. But the deeper resonance here is the fact that she is forced to confront the fact that the rotting antagonistic force that she has to defeat is in reality very similar to herself. Hama is the most direct manifestation externally of Katara's dark side, of her fears and dreads about the person that she could become. About what happens to those passionate impulses, that willingness to twist the rules a little in order to achieve the result one believes to be moral, when it is left to be twisted and distorted by this venomous loathing and this self-righteousness that comes from the line of thinking that because these people are bad, because they have done bad things, there is absolutely nothing wrong with delivering them sheer loathing and sheer disdain and dehumanizing them and not seeing them as actual people and not having to behave morally to them, not having to ask whether one's actions are just, because these people are innately unjust, and so whatever horrible actions one commits against them are necessarily justified. This is the trap that Katara has to avoid falling into. Thankfully, she does, and the true ending of her story, of her journey throughout the show, is the moment she decides to turn away from killing Yan-Ra in the Southern Raiders. Hama is, of course, not the only foil that Katara has. Jet is also a foil for her. He is another person that she feels a very deep and immediate connection for. Obviously, in Jet's case, it's a romantic connection. But even putting aside the romance, it's this deep sense of sympathy that she immediately feels with him, this deep sense of commonality, because they are both deeply committed to fighting the Fire Nation, to correcting a world that has fallen into injustice. They are both willful and intelligent. They're both clever to the point of being conniving. They're both stubborn to a certain extent and absolutely capable of setting aside conventional dictates of moral behavior in the pursuit of a higher and more profound moral truth. But for Jet, his perspective is too dogmatic, it is too myopic, it is too one-dimensional, and that leads to his suffering and to his eventual demise. He cannot turn away from that path. In this episode, she is left at its end, frustrated by her own frailty, frustrated by the fact that she's learned bloodbending, frustrated at the tragedy of what happened to Hama, but ultimately frustrated above all at the fact that despite her deep belief in her personal goodness and her passionate desire to be good, she has a lot in common, both in background and in ideology, with this woman who has been able to conduct such vile and such destructive actions against innocent people. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this. Before anyone else, keep watching Avatar. Adios, comrades.